And here I just wanted to show you another photo of the same exhibit and also a plan of the exhibit as it was published in the main magazine put out by the Kogei Shidojo, the Industrial Arts Institute from MITI. And you can see a little bit more clearly the way in this plan, especially, you have a progression here from the Japanese style room, which is over here, you can't see it anymore, to a kind of middle room, a living area, which is not quite tatami, but it's still a little bit low to the ground, and then finally to the fully Western style dining area over here on the right. And just in case you thought I was making it up about the tatami, you can see here that, well, in Japanese it says tatami dai, so tatami was actually put on there. And these, of course, are named akari. So, of course, the idea of integrating Mingei objects and Mingei aesthetics within a modern and even modernist vision of Japanese style was not entirely new in the early 1950s. And as I showed in my book, that Professor Thompson kindly referred to, before 1945, there were various initiatives to use Mingei in developing a kind of native modernism or indigenous modernism. And during the wartime years of the 1930s and early 1940s especially, the Japanese state became interested in Mingei as, among other things, a design resource to use in improving and promoting Japanese export goods. And indeed, it was the very same institutions within the state, the Kogei Shidojo, the Industrial Arts Institute, and what was then called the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, which was renamed in 1949 MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And it was precisely that same little block of institutions that began trying to use Mingei to improve and promote Japanese exports in the 1930s, as it would do again in the early 1950s. However, the types of exports that were being promoted were not exactly the same. So in 1955, we begin to see evidence of a new category of goods that was just beginning to become very important. And I don't know if you can just see it here. There's a Matsushita radio. so we see here the beginnings of a new category of Japanese exports. And that was, in fact, the purpose of these model rooms, was to promote Japanese exports. So, as suggested by the radio, the deployment of Mingei in the 1950s was also quite different and new in several ways that reflect the very different historical moment of this post-war period. So for one, the use of Mingei in the 1950s was very much related to the rise of Scandinavian design, which was, of course, taking the world by storm in the 1950s. And as suggested by the Helsingborg Exposition, Japanese folk modernism in the 1950s was to some degree modeled on and facilitated by the remarkable success of the Nordic countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Norway, in creating and marketing the category of Scandinavian design. And Japanese industrial policymakers, as well as designers and critics, were very conscious of the Scandinavian example. And this is a topic that really hasn't been explored adequately, and I recommend it to students who are thinking about future research. Japanese designers and policymakers devoted a great deal of time and energy in the 1950s to analyzing Nordic design, which they considered a model that was especially relevant to that of Japan. And so there was a lot of discussion at this time, for example, of the importance of handicrafts and folk elements in Scandinavian design. And just to give you one small example here, this is again the magazine put out by MITI called Kogei Nyusu. And this was a feature from 1954 on Swedish folk art, which was taken from a Swedish magazine. And it's, you know, one of the things that they're arguing is that, well, we have this too, and we can do something similar. So there was a growing consensus that Japan too could use its own handicraft and folk art traditions, which they felt were at least as rich as those of the Nordic countries, to come up with an equally appealing and marketable sort of warm modernism for home furnishings and other goods. Now, something else that was also new and different in the 1950s as compared to the 1930s is the way in which Mingei and folk modernism turned out to be useful as a way to represent Japan during a very awkward transitional stage in its post-war recovery and rise as a global economic power. And here I should note that throughout the 1950s and well into the 1960s, Japan had chronic trade deficits and was struggling to increase its exports to North America, especially, but also to Western Europe. And part of the problem was that there was a whole series of obstacles to the task of building markets for Japanese goods in in the West. So one problem was that Japanese manufactured goods had a reputation throughout the world for being of very poor quality. Okay, I know that's a little hard for us to imagine right now, but in the 1940s and 1950s, made in Japan was a phrase that connoted something shoddy and cheap, a little bit like the way made in China does today. And what Japan was actually exporting and making during the 1950s was largely the product of light industry, textiles, and especially a category of good known as zakka, or sundries. And I'm just showing you a couple of examples of the kinds of zakka that were being produced and exported. So a list would include toys, ceramic goods, rubber products like bicycle tires, flip-flops. This was the beginnings of the diffusion of flip-flops throughout the world. Metal products like tableware, glassware, Christmas ornaments, cultivated pearls, bamboo goods, umbrellas, artificial flowers, etc. And these zakka, or sundries, were generally manufactured in small workshops, sweatshops, in low-tech, very labor-intensive ways. They were very cheap, but they were also of variable and often low quality. And as you can see here, another problem, which you might be able to imagine, is that there was a big problem with imitation and trade piracy. So here we have a kind of vaguely Meissen-like knockoff for lampstands. And Japanese manufacturers at this time were regularly being accused and litigated against by European countries and by American industries and the American government for stealing designs and for producing unauthorized copies at lower prices. Now, both of these problems, this reputation of Japanese-made goods for being cheap and bad, that was the phrase that was sometimes used, and also for being illegal imitations, both of these were linked to another problem, which was simply the memory of World War II, which was very recent in the 1950s, and the stigma of Japanese goods as enemy goods, at least for former Allied powers. So my point is that Mingei and folk modernism, which were not low quality and they were not imitative, turned out to be very helpful to Japanese industrial planners and manufacturers during the 1950s and into the 60s as a means of eroding European and American prejudice and resistance against Japanese goods, and against the idea of Japan itself as a possibly illegitimate or untrustworthy trading partner. And I just want to note here that one of the several ways that folk modernism helped to promote Japanese exports and Japan itself in the post-war Atlantic community was by pushing especially back against accusations of design plagiarism and trade piracy, and also against the very persistent colonialist stereotypes about Japan as having an imitative modernity. And it was very convenient in this context to be able to hold up Mingei, because Mingei was at this time receiving international recognition for its originality and its integrity and its somehow natural inherent modernity at the same time that it was undeniably Japanese. And in fact, when it came to Mingei and folk modern designs, the imitators were often European and American. So, for example, this is an article that appeared in an English language yearbook put out by the Asahi newspaper called New Japan. And the article, for which these are illustrations, is showing that this Swedish pot is actually oddly similar to this piece of 19th century Japanese pottery. They're not coming out and saying that the Swedes are copying them, but it's definitely a suggestion. And this, you can't really read it, but this is from the Kurashiki Folk Art Museum. And here we have a photograph of a temporary arrangement from the interior of Ray and Charles Eames' home in Los Angeles, and this is from the early 1950s. Now, Ray and Charles Eames, of course, were these stars of mid-century design. No one would accuse them of being unoriginal or imitative, and yet here they were clearly drawing on Japanese sort of interior design to decorate their own home. So the third way that I want to focus on now, in which Mingei's integration within modern design in the 1950s represented something new, is that for the first time it actually began to reach a truly broad and even mass audience in Japan. Not in the US, not in Europe, but in Japan it did. Before 1945, despite the best efforts of Yanagi and Kawai and Hamada and their colleagues, the appreciation of Mingei and its modernist potential was restricted to a very small, even elite segment of Japanese society. But in the 1950s, with post-war recovery and the beginnings of high growth, Japan saw the rise of true mass consumerism. And I would suggest that the real impact of Mingei and folk modernism was most consequential here in the domestic context. So for the rest of my time, which I'm afraid may be running out, I'll focus on Mingei and folk modernism at home in Japan. And the basic argument, again, as I noted at the beginning, is that a very important factor in the rise of popularity of Mingei in the 50s was its linkage to folk modernism. And I will just add here that this combination of Mingei and folk modernism helped to validate and promote what we might call mass consumerism in Japan in its late capitalist sort of Euro-American mode. You know, this was not necessarily a natural development in the 1950s. And I want to develop this idea by looking at several categories of folk modernist consumerism as they developed over this decade. So first, let me start with architecture and interior design, where we see a distinct Mingei style developing in the early 1950s. This is a photograph of the exterior along with a plan of the Murakami residence. This is a private home in the Kanto region as it was built in the early 1950s by a designer named Ito Yasube. So initially, this kind of Mingei style architecture developed as a form of residential architecture. Now, Ito himself did not like the term Mingei style architecture, and he insisted instead that his work was inspired by the Japanese farmhouse, or minka. And certainly we can see that here by, for example, the construction and appearance of the gabled roof, and also the half timbering that we see here. These are distinctive features of a certain type of Japanese minka or farmhouse.